The morning rush swallowed the city street whole. Horns blaring, briefcases swinging, 1,000 people moving without seeing. And there, in the middle of it all, stood the small figure that didn't belong. Dark skin glowing in early light, hair pulled into a perfect bun, white school uniform crisp despite the modest quarters she came from. Pink backpack clutched tight. 8 years old, alone in a river of strangers, eyes wide with the kind of fear that makes children's hands shake. She stood directly in front of him. The man her mother warned her never to approach. The man whose tattooed neck told stories in ink that good people didn't ask about. The man whose name, Giovanni Morello, made city officials suddenly remember other appointments. A mafia boss. Giovanni was stepping out of his black SUV when she tugged his gray suit jacket. "Mr. Morello, sir," she whispered, voice trembling but determined. "Can you please walk me to school today? I don't feel safe anymore." His entire security team froze. Marco, his driver's hand stopped mid-reach for the car door. Even pedestrians closest to them slowed, phones lowering, sensing something impossible unfolding. No one approached Giovanni Morello like this. People asked him for mercy or favors they'd spend years repaying, for forgiveness for mistakes that usually ended in shallow graves. But never this. Never protection. Never from a child who should have been invisible. He knelt slowly, his tattooed hands folded in front of him, his voice low and careful. "Why aren't you safe, Princessa?" The girl, Taylor, hesitated, her small fingers gripping her backpack straps tighter. Then she pointed across the street. A man stood watching from beside a gray van, hands buried in pockets. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that made children's instincts scream danger. Giovanni's pulse ticked once, sharp and cold, because he recognized that stance, that predatory stillness. Victor Castellano's network. A trafficker who'd been testing the boundaries of his territory. A man who saw children not as innocents, but as inventory. Taylor's voice broke the silence again, small but brave. "I just want to get to school today without him following me anymore." Behind them, Elena Redmond rushed forward, her maid's uniform still being adjusted, horror written across her face. "Taylor! I'm so sorry, Mr. Morello. She didn't mean to." But Giovanni raised one hand, silencing her without looking away from the little girl. The maid's daughter, 8 years old, standing where she had no right to stand, asking what she had no right to ask. And yet here she was, choosing courage over invisibility because fear had finally outweighed every social boundary her mother had taught her to respect. The mafia boss stood up. And what he did next, in broad daylight, on a crowded city street, in front of his crew and the watching predator across the intersection, would shatter every unspoken rule between employer and employee, between the powerful and the powerless, and start a war that would force him to choose between his empire and his soul. Will a mafia boss keep his promise to protect one frightened child, or will that protection come at a deadly cost, paid in the blood of innocence he's never met? Before we dive into this story, where innocence collides with power and safety comes at a dangerous price, tell us in the comment where you're watching from, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Taylor had learned the rules before she could read. 4 of them, drilled into her by a mother who knew that survival in their world meant mastering the art of being unseen. Rule 1: never make eye contact with Mr. Morello or his men. Eyes down, always down. Their gaze could be mistaken for curiosity, and curiosity from people like them was dangerous. Rule 2: if you see something in the main house, you saw nothing. The conversations that stopped when she passed. The packages exchanged in hallways. The men with guns under expensive jackets. Nothing. Always nothing. Rule 3: speak only when spoken to. Questions were luxuries for people who could afford the answers. Rule 4: never ask the man who owns everything for anything. Not help, not mercy, not protection. Men like Giovanni Morello didn't give, they traded. And people like Taylor had nothing worth trading. Elena would hold her daughter's small face between her hands, repeating these rules like prayers. We're lucky, baby. Mr. Morello pays fair, never hurts staff, never raises his voice. That's rare. So we stay quiet, grateful, invisible. Her voice would crack on that last word, and Taylor learned that invisibility wasn't just survival. It was gratitude for being allowed to exist at all. But 3 weeks ago, invisibility stopped being enough. The gray van appeared on a Monday. Just a vehicle parked across from the school gates, engine idling, windows tinted dark. By Wednesday, it was there again. By Friday, Taylor could see him, the man with the smile that made her want to run but freeze at the same time. Casual clothes. Patient posture. Always watching. The following week, he moved closer, appearing near her walking route. Then outside the estate itself, just beyond the iron gates, as if testing boundaries. And always watching her with eyes that knew things children shouldn't have to understand. Last Tuesday he spoke. Hello, Taylor. She'd never told him her name. Never spoken to him. Never even looked directly at him. But he knew. And that knowing was worse than any threat. Elena went to the police station that same afternoon. Officer Ruiz barely looked up from his paperwork. Children have active imaginations, Miss Redmond. She went back Wednesday. Same response. Thursday, she brought the route Taylor walked, the times, the descriptions. Without evidence of actual contact or threats, we can't investigate. Come back when something actually happens. Friday. Miss Redmond, I understand you're concerned. Monday. The 5th visit. Officer Ruiz's patience had worn thin. Ma'am, you need to understand that we have limited resources. We can't investigate every parent's anxiety. The unspoken message rang clear in the sterile police station. A maid's concerns don't carry the same weight as others. Your fear doesn't matter. Your daughter doesn't matter. Not to us. This morning, Elena woke burning with fever, her body finally surrendering to the stress and exhaustion she'd been ignoring for weeks. Too weak to stand. Too sick to walk Taylor to school. Too helpless to protect her own child. Taylor stood in their small quarters, her pink backpack already on, her uniform pressed, her hair pulled into its perfect bun. She looked at her mother shivering under thin blankets. Then she looked at the clock. 7:45. School started at 8:30. 8 blocks. Alone. The impossible choice crystallized with brutal clarity: face the predator alone and follow every rule her mother had taught her, or break every single one and ask the one man powerful enough to make the watching stop. Fear finally outweighed invisibility. She walked out of the staff quarters, through the back corridors of the estate, past the marble she wasn't supposed to touch, and straight toward the front entrance where Giovanni Morello's black SUV was just pulling up to the curb. 20 years of surviving in organized crime had sharpened Giovanni's instincts to lethal precision. He could identify an undercover cop by their shoes, too new, too practical, wrong brand for the neighborhood. He could spot a lie in someone's breathing pattern, the slight hitch before words that didn't quite fit. He could predict betrayal before the traitor even knew they'd made the decision, reading it in the way they stopped meeting his eyes, the way they touched their phones too often, the way loyalty became performance. When the small hand tugged his sleeve, he knew 3 things instantly. 1. She was genuinely terrified. Not the manufactured fear people used to manipulate him, not the strategic tears that came with requests. Real terror, the kind that made children shake despite every effort to be brave. 2. She had absolutely no idea how dangerous this was. How many rules she was breaking. How many ways this moment could go horribly wrong. 3. Whatever drove her to break those rules was worth killing for. Elena Redmond rushed forward, her maid's uniform still being adjusted, absolute horror written across her face. Taylor! Mr. Morello, I'm so sorry. She didn't mean to bother you. Giovanni raised one hand, silencing her without looking away from the child. His dark eyes tracked to where Taylor had pointed. Across the street. Gray van, casual clothes, predatory stillness. The kind of patience that came from hunting things that couldn't fight back. Recognition hit cold and sharp. Victor Castellano's network. One of his traffickers, operating in Giovanni's territory, stalking a child who lived under his roof. The disrespect alone was worth a war. But it was more than business. More than territory. It was the yellow dress. The memory came unbidden, visceral, 25 years old but fresh as morning blood. Giovanni at 10 years old, small for his age, hiding behind his mother Rosa in their cramped apartment, as rival family soldiers burst through the door. The smell of gun oil and fear. Rosa's yellow dress bright against the gray walls. "Run, Giovanni! Run!" She threw herself between him and the bullets. 3 shots sent her mass. The yellow dress turning red, spreading like spilled wine, like the end of everything good in his world. He held her as she died, her blood warm and sticky on his small hands, her breathing wet and labored. "Protect those who cannot protect themselves, Giovanni." Her voice barely a whisper, each word costing her. "Promise me. Don't let this world turn you into them." 10-year-old Giovanni, covered in his mother's blood, his world shattering around him. "I promise, Mama. I promise." He made that promise kneeling on a floor slick with her life. And then he'd spent 25 years burying it under violence, profit, and the brutal mathematics of survival. Power without purpose. Control without meaning. An empire built on everything except the one thing she'd asked him to remember. Until now. Until a small girl in a white uniform with a pink backpack stood where she had no right to stand and asked him to keep a promise he made to a dying woman in a yellow dress. Giovanni came back to the present. The busy street. The watching predator. The terrified child. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Young Giovanni, powerless and protected by someone who loved him. Young Taylor, powerless and seeking protection from someone who'd forgotten how. He knelt slowly before Taylor, his tattooed hands folded in front of him, his voice low and careful. The morning sun caught the ink crawling up his neck, dark secrets written on skin, stories she was too young to read but old enough to fear. "Show me who's been following you, Princessa." And when she pointed with trembling fingers at the man across the street, Giovanni Morello made a choice that would honor his mother's dying wish or destroy everything he'd built trying. Maybe both. Giovanni took Taylor's small hand in his tattooed one. The visual was shocking. This dark-skinned child with her neat bun and crisp uniform, her small brown fingers wrapped around the scarred, ink-covered hand of a man whose touch usually meant violence, ordeals sealed in blood. Everyone watching knew it. The impossible had become visible. They walked through city streets, skyscrapers towering overhead, morning commuters stopping mid-stride to stare. Mrs. Chin paused outside her corner bakery, flour still dusting her apron, mouth slightly open. Mr. Santos froze at his newsstand, morning paper forgotten in his hands. Windows opened in apartment buildings above them, faces appearing like flowers turning toward unexpected sunlight. This defied every law of their world. Giovanni walked slowly, matching Taylor's small stride, his 3-man security team flanking them but at a distance. Respectful. Protective. But giving the moment the space it demanded. Taylor's voice came quiet, meant only for him. "He's been there for 3 weeks. Every morning. He knows my name, but I never told him. He gets closer every day." Giovanni's jaw tightened, muscle jumping beneath his beard. "Your mama went to the police?" "5 times. Taylor's fingers squeezed his hand tighter. "Officer Rees said she was imagining things because we're." Giovanni finished quietly, the ugly truth laid bare between them. "Because your complaints don't carry the same weight as others." He pulled out his phone, never breaking stride, never letting go of her hand. "First call. Marco. I need background checks on every adult male seen near Lincoln Elementary in the past month. Prioritize anyone with vehicles suitable for transport. I want names, addresses, known associates on my desk in 2 hours." Second call. "Elena Redmond's accommodations are being upgraded immediately. Staff housing, Section C, the renovated wing. Full health coverage, salary increase, security detail. Make it happen before she finishes her shift. Third call. His voice went colder, sharper. Captain Torres. There's a credible threat against children in my district. I'm texting you a description and plate number. Investigate properly this time instead of dismissing concerned mothers based on their tax brackets. Pause. Let the silence work. I have recordings of Officer Reese's 5 conversations with Miss Redmond. Would you like me to forward them to the mayor's office? Or perhaps Channel 7 News? Longer silence on the other end. Then, we'll look into it immediately, Mr. Morello. 3 phone calls. 3 minutes. One child's entire world restructured with the casual efficiency of a man who'd learned long ago that power was only real if you could wield it precisely. They were 2 blocks from school now. Taylor hadn't let go of his hand. Why are you helping me? Her voice carried genuine confusion. Mama says important people don't help people like us. She says we're lucky if they just don't notice us. Giovanni stopped walking. Right there on the busy sidewalk, morning traffic flowing around them, phones already recording this moment for networks that would try to make sense of it later. He knelt again, bringing himself to her eye level, ignoring everything except the child in front of him. Your mama is wrong about something, Princessa. His voice was gentle but certain. Power that doesn't protect the innocent is just cruelty with better clothes. I have power, real power. And if I don't use it to keep children like you safe, then what's the point? I'm just another predator in an expensive suit. Taylor's eyes widened. And impossibly, despite everything, the fear, the 3 weeks of being hunted, the rules she'd broken, she smiled. You talk like my mama when she thinks I'm asleep. She says you're scary, but not mean. Giovanni felt something shift in his chest, something that hadn't moved in 25 years. He surprised himself when he answered. Your mama is very wise. By 6 that evening, the photographs had circulated through every criminal network in the city. Digital ghosts moving through encrypted channels, passed between men who traded in violence and understood that information was more valuable than bullets. Victor Castellano's office occupied a luxury warehouse conversion overlooking the harbor. Leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. He spread 3 clear photos across his mahogany desk, each one capturing a moment that shouldn't exist in their world. Giovanni Morello kneeling on a sidewalk, holding a child's hand. Looking at her with something almost like tenderness. Victor leaned back in his chair, silver hair catching the harbor light, expensive watch glinting as he steepled his fingers. 50-something, cold eyes that had watched men die without blinking. Morello's going soft. Dante Russo, his lieutenant, picked up one of the photos. 20 years of being untouchable, and now he's playing bodyguard to the help's kid. Leo Marconi, another associate, shook his head. It's worse than soft. He's emotionally invested. That makes him predictable. Vulnerable. Exactly. Victor's voice carried satisfaction. For 6 months, he's blocked our expansion into his territory, refused partnerships, turned down profitable deals, all because of his so-called principles about innocence and children. He spat the words like curses, like weaknesses that had no place in their business. But now we know his weakness. He cares. And men who care can be manipulated. Dante shifted uncomfortably. Boss, this is Morello we're talking about. He's killed men for less than what you're suggesting. He's killed men who threatened his business. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. But this isn't business. This is personal. That's the point. So what's the play? We grab the girl tomorrow morning. Quick, clean, before he can react. Send him a message. Sentiment is a liability he can't afford. Leo asked the obvious question. And then what? Then we negotiate. He backs off our operations, gives us 3 territories, and maybe, we give him back the girl unharmed. We prove his protection means nothing when we decide to act. The men nodded, convinced. In their world, it made perfect sense. Exploit the weakness. Apply pressure. Force compliance. What they didn't know, 3 blocks away, in an apartment Giovanni had purchased under a shell company 6 months ago, Marco sat with headphones pressed to his ears, listening to every word. The listening device had been planted during a routine fire inspection Giovanni had arranged. Just another chess piece moved into position long before the game began. Marco's phone was already dialing. "Boss, they're moving tomorrow morning. 8:15, between the estate and school. Dante Russo and 2 others. They're planning to grab Taylor." Silence on the other end. Long enough that Marco checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Giovanni's voice came through, cold enough to freeze blood. "Let them try." Marco blinked. "Sir? You heard me, Marco. Let them come. But I want every available man in position by 7 a.m. Undercover, neighbors, shopkeepers, utility workers. I want that 8-block radius saturated with our people pretending to be civilians. When Russo makes his move, I want witnesses everywhere. Good witnesses. The kind that make police investigations very straightforward. What about the girl? Triple her protection, but make it invisible. I don't want Victor spooked. Let him think he has the advantage right up until the moment he realizes he's walked into a trap." Marco allowed himself a grim smile. "This is going to start a war, boss." Giovanni's response came without hesitation. "The war started the moment one of his hunters stood outside my estate stalking a child under my protection. Tomorrow we just make it official." Elena woke to sunlight streaming through windows that shouldn't exist in her cramped quarters. She blinked, disoriented, fever-hazed, mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Clean cream walls instead of peeling paint. A real bed with a headboard instead of the sagging mattress on the floor. A modern kitchenette. A small living area with actual furniture. Space 3 times larger than what she'd fallen asleep in. Medical supplies lined the counter. Fever reducers, antibiotics, a thermometer still in its package. And on the nightstand, a handwritten note in masculine script. "Your daughter's courage inspired this. You both deserve better. G.M." Elena's hands trembled holding the note. Tears streamed down her face, not from fever this time, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The dangerous kind that made you believe the world could be different. She found Taylor already dressed, standing by the window in her white uniform, pink backpack ready. "Mama, there are a lot of people outside today." That morning, when Giovanni's black SUV pulled up to the estate, he wasn't alone. 8 of his men flanked him, visible and armed. A show of force that made passers-by cross to the other side of the street. But something else had happened overnight. The neighborhood had awakened. Mrs. Chen stood outside her bakery with a tray of fresh pastries, her expression determined rather than fearful. Mr. Santos positioned himself on the corner, arms crossed, watching. Parents walked children to school earlier than usual, forming small clusters along the route. Not hiding. Not hurrying. Present. Word had spread through the Whisper network, the invisible infrastructure that connected maids to janitors to shopkeepers to delivery drivers. Giovanni Morello was protecting one of their own. If the most powerful man in the city thought their children were worth defending, maybe they should act like it too. At 8:15 exactly, Dante Russo and 2 men emerged from a gray van 3 blocks from school. Their plan was simple: grab Taylor during the narrow window, throw her in the van, disappear before Giovanni could react. But when they moved toward Taylor walking hand in hand with Giovanni, something impossible happened. Mrs. Chen stepped directly into their path, holding her pastry tray like a shield. "Excuse me, gentlemen. Can I offer you something? You look lost." Mr. Santos appeared at Dante's shoulder. "Yes, definitely lost. School is that way. Are you fathers? I don't recognize you from PTA meetings." More neighbors materialized, not threatening, not armed, just present. 20 people. 30. Parents with children, shopkeepers, office workers on their way to work. All stopping. All watching. All positioned between the predators and their prey. A human wall made of nothing but bodies and the willingness to finally be seen. Mrs. Chen spoke again, quietly but clearly. This is our neighborhood. These are our children. The sound of sirens cut through the morning air. 2 police cruisers pulled up, lights flashing. Captain Torres stepped forward, his face professionally neutral but his eyes carrying the message. This was the price of Giovanni's recordings. Dante Russo, we need you to come with us. We have questions about your activities in this area. As Dante was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted with fury and disbelief, Giovanni turned to address the crowd. His voice carried across the street, reaching every person who'd chosen courage over invisibility. This, he gestured to the neighbors who'd stood their ground, is what happens when a community decides to protect its own. Thank you. Applause started slowly, tentatively, then built into something stronger. Something that sounded like hope finding its voice. What none of them knew. Victor Castellano was already moving his next piece across the board. And this time, the price would be paid in blood that wasn't theirs to give. The courier arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon. Professional. Anonymous. Nondescript uniform that could have belonged to any of a dozen delivery services. Marcos signed for the manila envelope, his instincts screaming wrong before he'd even opened it. Inside, 4 school photographs, standard 8x10s with red X's slashed violently across smiling children's faces. 7-year-old Miguel Santos from St. Augustine Elementary, taken from the playground at 1:15. 9-year-old Sophia Chen from Riverside Academy, vanished during dismissal at 2 o'clock. 6-year-old Isabella Torres from Holy Trinity School, last seen in the parking lot at 2:20. 10-year-old Marcus Williams from Northside Elementary, disappeared walking home at 2:35. 4 children. 4 different schools. 4 neighborhoods where Giovanni Morello had no presence, no influence, no ability to intervene. All taken within 90 minutes of Dante Russo's arrest. The message scrolled on the back of each photo in elegant script. You saved 1, we took 4. You can't protect them all, Morello. But it was the 5th photograph that made Marco's blood turn to ice. Taylor Redmond, smiling in her school picture from last year, hair in her neat bun, eyes bright with the innocence that should never know fear. Someone had drawn crosshairs over her face in red ink. The message on this one was different. Tomorrow, the maid's daughter pays for your arrogance. Marco was already moving toward Giovanni's office when Elena's scream echoed through the estate. She'd been bringing afternoon tea service when she saw the photos spread across Marco's desk. The tray crashed to the marble floor, porcelain shattering like the last fragments of safety she'd believed in. Her knees gave out. Oh God! Oh God! No! This is my fault. I should never have let her ask you for help. Those children. Those poor children. Because of us. Because of Taylor. Taylor ran from their new quarters, drawn by her mother's anguish. She saw the photos. Saw the red X's marking children who looked like they could be her classmates, her friends. Her young face went pale. But she didn't cry. Instead, she knelt beside her mother with composure that shouldn't exist in an 8-year-old. Her small hand found Elena's trembling one. No, Mama. This isn't your fault. Her voice was steady, certain. It's his fault. The bad man who takes children. Not you. Not me. Not Mr. Morello. Giovanni arrived, his face a mask of cold fury that made even Marco step back. 4 missing children. 4 families destroyed. All because he dared to protect one little girl who'd asked him for help. Taylor looked up at him, her hands still holding her mother's. In her eyes, absolute, unwavering trust. The kind of faith that could save a soul or destroy it. You're going to stop him, right, Mr. Morello? You're going to find those kids and bring them home. The weight of that trust was heavier than any debt he'd ever carried, more binding than any oath he'd ever sworn. 4 children he'd never met, taken because he'd made Victor look weak. This was the price of protection. When you drew a line in the sand against men who saw humans as commodities, they didn't retreat, they escalated. Giovanni knelt beside Taylor, meeting her eyes with the same honesty he'd shown that first morning on the busy street. Yes, Princessa. I'm going to find them. All of them. And I'm going to make sure this never happens again. Promise? He thought of his mother's last words, of the promise made 25 years ago covered in her blood, of this little girl who'd been brave enough to ask a monster for help and kind enough to believe he could be more. I promise. Marco laid out the brutal mathematics on Giovanni's desk. Maps with red circles marking locations, resource allocations, personnel deployments. The kind of operational planning that reduced human lives to numbers and logistics. We can't do both, boss. His voice was steady, professional. We don't have the manpower to fortify the estate and conduct a citywide search for 4 missing children. Victor knows this. That's why he did it. Force us to choose. The smart play is fortress protection around Taylor and Elena. Lock down the estate. Let the police handle the kidnappings. We keep our promise to the one we can actually protect. Giovanni stared at the photographs spread across his desk. Miguel Santos, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile that should have had years ahead of it. Sophia Chin, 9, glasses too big for her small face, looking at the camera with shy hope. Isabella Torres, 6, ribbons and dark hair, young enough to still believe the world was safe. Marcus Williams, 10, serious expression that suggested he'd already learned otherwise. 4 children he'd never met. 4 families who never asked him for anything. 4 lives hanging in the balance because he'd walked one little girl to school and made Victor Castellano look weak. Through his office window, he could see Taylor helping Elena to the couch, bringing her water, speaking in that calm voice that shouldn't belong to a child with a target drawn on her back. Marco followed his gaze. She's safe here, boss. We can keep her safe. But those other kids, they're in 4 different locations by now, maybe already out of the city. This is a losing battle. Don't throw away what you can protect trying to save what you can't. It was the smart play. The logical play. The play every rule of organized crime said he should make. Protect your own. Cut your losses. Don't let emotion override strategy. Sentiment was a liability men like them couldn't afford. Giovanni thought of his mother. Yellow dress soaking red. Whispering last words with blood on her lips, each breath costing her more than the last. Protect those who cannot protect themselves, Giovanni. Promise me. He'd been 10 years old. 1 child. The only child she could save with the last act of her life. But he wasn't 10 anymore. He wasn't powerless, hiding behind a dying woman who'd given everything to keep him breathing. He was Giovanni Morello. He controlled half the city's infrastructure, a quarter of its political apparatus, enough resources to wage a war that would reshape the entire criminal landscape. He had power his mother couldn't have imagined when she bled out on that apartment floor. And what was power for if not this? Then we make the resources, he said quietly. Marco blinked. Sir? Quadruple security around Taylor and Elena. I want this estate locked down like a military installation. But also mobilize everyone, and I mean everyone. Every associate, every contact, every debt owed, every favor outstanding. Pull people from the docks, the construction sites, the gambling operations. I don't care if business stops for a week. We're finding those children. Boss, this goes against every rule of organized crime. Yes, I know. Giovanni stood, his decision crystallizing into certainty, solid as the marble floors beneath his feet. His mother's promise. Taylor's trust. 4 children whose only crime was existing in Victor's revenge fantasy. Get me addresses for the families. All 4. Marco stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, understanding what this meant. Not just a choice. A transformation. Giovanni Morello was about to become something his world had never seen. A guardian who refused to choose. An hour later, Giovanni walked into Miguel Santos's small apartment in the barrio. The boy's mother, Carmen Santos, sat on a worn couch surrounded by useless police officers taking notes they'd never follow up on, and helpless neighbors murmuring empty comfort. Giovanni came alone. No guards. No weapons. No displays of power. Just a man in an expensive suit with tattoos on his neck and guilt in his eyes. "Mrs. Santos, my name is Giovanni Morello. I'm here to help find your son." She looked up through swollen, red-rimmed eyes. "Help? You're the reason he's gone. Everyone knows Victor took those children because of you." The accusation landed like a blade between his ribs because it was true. Every word of it. "You're right," he said simply. "This is my fault. Which is why I will bring Miguel home. No payment. No debt. This is my responsibility." He knelt before her, this grieving mother in her tiny apartment with its peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture, and made the same promise he'd made to Taylor. Then he visited Sophia Chen's family, Isabella Torres's family, Marcus Williams's family. Each time he knelt. Each time he promised. Each time he took the weight of their pain onto his shoulders until it threatened to break him. That evening, in a neighborhood square crowded with frightened parents and curious onlookers, Giovanni made a public declaration that shattered every tradition of organized crime. He stood on an improvised platform, wooden crates stacked too high, flanked by Marco but addressing the crowd alone. His voice carried across the square. "Any child in this territory is now under my protection. If you see something suspicious, call these numbers." He held up cards with contact information. "No retaliation. No cost. No conditions. Your children's safety is not negotiable." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Why should we trust you? You're a criminal." Giovanni met the speaker's eyes directly. "Because a brave little girl trusted me first, and I refused to prove her wrong. Because my mother taught me that power without purpose is just violence. Because if I can't protect innocence, then I deserve to lose everything I've built." Silence. Then scattered applause building into something stronger, something that sounded like hope finding its voice in the dark. The tips began flooding in. 11:47 p.m. Janitor at East Side Industrial Park reported suspicious activity at an abandoned textile factory, saw men unloading something from a van, heard what might have been children crying. 12:05 a.m. Night nurse at St. Mary's Hospital noticed a man buying unusual quantities of children's medication at the 24-hour pharmacy, paid cash, refused to give his name. 12:33 a.m. Delivery driver saw a gray van with tinted windows parked behind a warehouse in Sector 9, saw a man carrying what looked like food supplies for multiple people. 1:15 a.m. Building superintendent reported an apartment in his building rented 2 weeks ago, cash payment, tenants never seen during the day, heard children's voices at odd hours. Suddenly people were talking. The same community that had learned to see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, was finding its voice because one little girl had found hers first. By 3 a.m., Marco had triangulated the location, warehouse complex on the industrial waterfront, technically outside Giovanni's territory but close enough. Thermal imaging showed 4 heat signatures. Small bodies. Not moving much. Giovanni made one more call, to Captain Torres. "I have a location. You can either work with me on this and be the hero who saved 4 children, or you can obstruct and I'll make sure every news outlet in the city knows you had the chance and chose politics over kids' lives." Long pause. "What do you need?" "Tactical unit. Dawn raid. And when this is over, we never speak of our cooperation again." "Agreed." Dawn broke over the industrial waterfront in shades of amber and steel. The warehouse doors blew open with controlled violence, flash bangs, shouting, the controlled chaos of a tactical unit that knew exactly what they were doing. Miguel Santos emerged first. 7 years old, scared, tear-stained, but unharmed. He ran into his mother's arms waiting behind the police line, and Carmen Santos sobbed like her heart was breaking and healing at the same time. Then Sophia Chin. Isabella Torres. Marcus Williams. 4 children who'd been gone for 18 hours but felt like 18 years to the families who'd lost them. Parents sobbing, holding their children like they'd never let go again. Like proximity alone could undo the nightmare. Victor Castellano was arrested trying to flee through the back exit, silver hair disheveled, expensive watch catching the morning light, cold eyes finally showing the fear he'd spent a lifetime inflicting on others. His network, built on secrecy and terror, crumbled the moment people stopped being afraid to speak. Dante Russo turned evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence: names, locations, bank accounts, everything needed to dismantle an operation that had been running for 5 years. 3 days later, the same neighborhood square where Giovanni had made his promise was packed with families. Aaliyah Thompson, Elena's neighbor, fellow maid who'd also been dismissed by police, stood and spoke, her voice trembling but determined. "My name is Aaliyah Thompson. I'm a maid at the Morello estate. Nobody listens to maids. We're supposed to be invisible, grateful, quiet. But Elena's daughter was braver than any of us. When she was scared, she asked for help. When we were scared, we stayed silent." She looked around at faces watching her, faces like hers, working people, invisible people finding their voices. "If an 8-year-old girl can find the courage to speak up, what's our excuse? If she can do that, we all can." Elena stood next to her, tears streaming but head held high. Applause started slowly, then built like thunder rolling through the square. Giovanni announced the Morello Foundation for Child Safety, funded by legitimate businesses, staffed by former social workers and retired police who actually cared. 24/7 hotline answered in multiple languages. Resources for families. Pressure on authorities to take reports seriously regardless of who filed them. This isn't charity. This is responsibility. This city failed these families. I failed these families. That ends now. 2 weeks later, Giovanni walked Taylor to school again. But this time they weren't alone. Dozens of children walked with them, Miguel Santos holding Carmen's hand, Sophia Ching chattering with friends, Isabella Torres skipping ahead with ribbons in her hair, Marcus Williams walking tall. Elena walked too, head high, no longer invisible but seen, really seen. Parents nodded to Giovanni. Some even smiled, not because they forgot who he was, but because they'd seen who he could choose to be. At the school gates, Taylor looked up at him with those serious dark eyes that had started everything. "Mr. Morello, are the bad men all gone now? The ones who take children?" He knelt one more time, this ritual that had become theirs. "The ones who were here, yes. But there will always be more bad men, Princessa. That's why we have to stay watchful. That's why your community has to stay awake. That's why I'll keep this promise. And you'll help us? Always." Giovanni thought of his mother's yellow dress, of her last breath, of the promise that had defined 25 years of his life without him fully understanding it until now. "You taught me something important. Power without purpose is just violence. For years I had power but no real purpose. Thank you for showing me the difference." Taylor smiled, that fearless smile that changed everything, and hugged him before running to join her friends. Giovanni stood watching children disappear into school, realizing what this small girl had awakened in him: the ability to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down, to be the guardian his mother died hoping he'd become. Marco approached. "The men are asking, boss. What's next for the organization?" Giovanni watched Taylor wave from the school entrance. "Next? We expand the foundation to every neighborhood in the city. We make sure every child has what Taylor asked me for, to feel safe. That's what's next. That's not traditional organized crime, boss. No. It's not." Giovanni allowed himself a slight smile. "It's better. One act of courage. One simple request. One child brave enough to ask a monster for help. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. Because courage knows no age, no social class, no boundaries. And sometimes the most unlikely guardian is exactly what innocence needs. The war for every child's safety has just begun. And heroes aren't always who you expect them to be. If Taylor's courage moved you, if Giovanni's transformation gave you chills, if you believe one act of bravery can change everything, then this story deserves to reach more people. Hit that like button right now. Not later. Right now. Because stories about courage protecting innocence need to be seen. Drop a comment telling me, would you have had the courage to ask for help like Taylor did? Or would you have stayed silent? I read every single comment. Share this with someone who needs to remember that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear expensive suits with tattooed necks and hearts that remember their promises. And subscribe, because I'm telling more stories like this. Stories where the powerless find their voice. Stories where monsters choose to become guardians. Stories that remind us that courage is contagious. The question isn't whether you enjoyed this story. The question is, will you help it reach the person who needs to hear it most? Like, comment, share, subscribe. Because one little girl's bravery sparked a revolution. Imagine what yours could do